Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Des Moines, Iowa, Iowa Catholic Radio. We are into our 8-year adventure, coming up on 9, go into the 9th year, that's what it is. With The Uncommon Good, I'm Bo Bonner, host of the Catholic Morning Show. So for all of our new listeners who heard me there and came over here to catch the Bo and Bud show, thank you for listening. Bud, what do you do here in these Iowa counties?
There is a college in downtown Des Moines. It is Catholic. It is called Mercy College of Health Sciences. There, I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences.
That was very dramatic. Have you been watching movies or listening to documentaries anytime recently?
I just find that, if work is characterized by drudgery or your colleagues don't respect you as much as you'd like them to, I'm not saying those are issues, but one way to liven up the workspace, regardless of how things have been going, is to enter it in a fog, through a fog machine with dramatic music.
I was wondering where the fog was coming in. I was like, oh, I thought
dun, dun,
nice.
dun, 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 dun. Yeah.
Laser light show, Bud.
And, there's science professors nearby and they wonder what's going on. I'm just showing up for the day.
Instead of the dark side of the moon, it's the dark side of the Marr. Did you listen to Pink Floyd, by the way? This is actually going to be pertinent to the show. Did you ever go see a laser light show at, what are they called? Where you go look at the stars.
Oh, the observatory?
Yeah. And then they have, their man, what are those called? Any rate, the point is you're supposed to go there and they show you the stars, but then they have Pink Floyd and it's like The Wall. Did you see that? You know what I'm talking about?
No, in college, someone did host one of those parties where you start The Wizard of Oz and Dark Side of the Moon at the same time. They're supposed to match up.
Oh, yeah. I think, do you remember? Did it match up enough?
I didn't attend. I was studying.
What I remember, right, and I think all it took was for people to believe this, to be true, quote unquote, is when the song Money comes on, isn't there change or dollar bills or something? I forget, but evidently that was enough proof, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, one of the true believers told me midway through it starts to break down a little bit. We need to read about that more. Did Pink Floyd plan this or?
No, well, I don't think they're going to let us know either way. The reason this actually has something to do with things, folks, is we have started, I don't think we're calling it the Technology Roundup, but we're talking about a series on technology and the faith. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is a little Bo and Bud prehistory of our experiences with technology. I think it's going to be a lighthearted episode, but I know how we are. It might turn dark quick. However, I want to point out that we lived through a very interesting switch in time from the 1980s technology into what we have now. We'll get into all of that, but that's why I think the Pink Floyd laser light show actually matters, because I think if we could go back in time and try to convince our kids about why that seemed cool. I think if we go show them a laser light show of Pink Floyd, they wouldn't. Oh, the planetarium. That was the word I was thinking of. I don't think they would be impressed. I think they regularly see things as cool as the Pink Floyd laser light show at the planetarium regularly through their devices, and it wouldn't be nearly as cool.
It's hard to impress kids these days. You're right. We lived through an era where there was rapid advancement in certain technologies, and it's interesting now to watch movies that, as a kid, even the original Star Wars trilogy, I know they've been touched up a bit, but the graphic effects in those films compared to, you get to Jurassic Park, and there were things that they did with Jurassic Park that was, groundbreaking. But, most of that pales in comparison to what they pull off today.
And so I think this should be a lighthearted episode in some ways, but in others, I hope it's the most illustrative. It really illustrates what we're getting at, is that we have actually all lived through multiple revolutions, and that can't help but change the way we inhabit the bodies we do and the sort of theology of technology that we must come up with. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, stick around. This is The Uncommon Good. Back with the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It's wonderful to have you with us, no matter how it is you access the show, whether you're listening live through the Iowa Catholic Radio airwaves, iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or our wonderful podcast listeners. Thank you for listening to the show. But we've been talking about technology. Well, we have one show in, but we've promised a lot of shows talking about technology. There's all sorts of things we're going to end up to talk about. But one thing that I thought might be important is by sort of talking about technological change in our lives, like literally Bo and Bud, the hosts, 40-somethings, that it might illustrate the sheer radicality of the technological change we've dealt with in ways that people just take for granted. And so not only is it like, oh, we're on radio, which is supposedly this old and dying, medium, but actually, weirdly enough, it has a staying power that maybe we can get into. But do you want to know what made me think about why we should do this episode?
Yes.
So I was in the mall, which I don't do. Even that sounds antiquated. It sounds like I was going to the sock hop. But I went to the mall, not because I was hanging at the mall, but because that was where the computer store was that I needed to get a new battery for my computer. And this mall, which will go unnamed because I don't think we can advertise them. But at any rate, if you go through the center part of this mall, I looked up and they had a billboard screen. It wasn't even a billboard screen. It was a screen just advertising stuff that I realized was bigger than any movie theater screen that I had throughout at least into college.
Oh, yeah.
And then I all of a sudden remembered the computer store I was at had a screen on the wall, probably bigger than most of the movie screens that I watched like E.T. on and things like this. And I start to go, goodness gracious, these massive, and I've heard people confirm this, that specifically with TVs, we've made such absolute revolutions in television that TVs in some sense are so good, they're mostly worthless to most of us. The only way that you can show off how good they are is if they're big enough to put like at the top of the ceiling of a mall and be impressed about like that it looks like you're looking at TV. This made me think of our duck hunt conversation last week. And so I go, it's actually important for us to all stop and take a breath. I think that's something that doesn't happen in the technological age, is we don't stop and take a breath. We are nostalgic about stuff, and we'll buy nostalgia albums and items, and maybe we can talk about that in the second half. But it's hard to stop and actually say, even in our relatively short lifetimes, Bud, we're not talking about the 1800s. We're talking about the very end of the 1900s, how much things are different. Yeah. And so to get things rolling, when you think about an item that if you explain to your children, we were really excited to have X, whatever it is, and if you told them, they would be flabbergasted that you were excited to get it. Is there anything that immediately comes to mind?
Well, I think with what you're getting at, I would actually say the pager. Because as you're talking to me, one of the major changes from when I was like 10 to when I was 30 is kind of the collapse of space and time when it comes to communication. And I just, thinking about being at school and if someone like needed to get a hold of you, right around the time of middle school, like pagers became popular. And so someone could like text you their number. And then if you found a phone, you could call them back or whatnot. But now it's like there's just this immediacy to it. And that's affected our attention span, but it's also, I feel like one kind of ethical issue that we face in the modern world is that you take the sort of like the speed and immediacy of telecommunication, and you combine it with the power of video, and the world's evils, the world's tragedies are sort of thrust in front of your face. And I think for me, certainly our generation, like a seminal moment or one that just is charred in our memories is 9/11. And at the time, what struck me is like we really did kind of gather around our televisions. It was kind of this communal thing. But the images that you saw did remind you of sort of prominent movies. And so it was kind of this like, it was sort of this surreal, like this is happening. People are actually losing their lives. And yet there was, you sort of had to keep pinching yourself like this is actually taking place in concrete world. It's not like this kind of like fabricated event.
Well, even for that one, and I actually want to go back to that, but just with 9/11, I realize I was telling either my kids or a group of students, I said the thing that struck me most at the time to your point, seeing the planes, and by the way, 9/11 is this interesting event where it's sort of like the last, like you said, worldwide, quote-unquote, communal television event, but it's also one of the first internet events. Because I remember going and waiting for CNN.com to like take forever to load in order to see something that I just watched on TV. But I said the thing that struck me the most, that haunts me to this day, is they had their first like Dateline or one of those sort of shows where, or it was like CBS Today or whatever. And if you remember back in the day, they had the reporters, they had their desk, but then behind them was an open window to the streets of New York City. And so usually when you're watching that show, it's like, oh, they're talking, you just see people walking back and forth. But that day, every single inch of that window was covered with people who had a photo of their loved one they hadn't found. And so this sort of intergenerational medial conglomeration, right? Like we're watching on TV. We all know it because we all heard about it. But then it's humans with photographs of faces. And like the idea was just the hope of if you've seen them. And I don't know how anybody would have. I think some might have had phone numbers or whatever, but it was this tragedy. People aren't thinking. I don't know what I would have done, but that to me struck me. Right, it's like all these people. They're like maybe that they can be caught a glimpse on camera, and I realize now what you would do is you would immediately go tweet pictures of your missing relative, which is not. I mean, okay, that might be actually a good use of social media. But to me, that's a world that's gone. Like the first idea, if you had someone missing after a tragedy like 9/11, is not to go try to find the television and put their face up to be on the broadcast. You would go about it in different means, and that starts to be one of the revolutionary differences even from then to then.
You graduated like from college 2004? Three.
Yeah, 99 was my first year in college.
It's crazy to me, and maybe Oklahoma State is more advanced than John Brown was, but we really lived through... My college years was this kind of watershed in changes.
Oh, yeah.
Because, so, Rachel and I were together my first year of college. We were both at John Brown University. There was some drama in the relationship that we don't have to cover on the show, but we actually weren't dating our first year of college at the same college, but when she went to Nebraska-Lincoln, we started back dating. And that year when she went to Lincoln, we bought each other phone cards. Because you still, like for long distance, like the phone card, it was like, 75 minutes to talk. But then it was college where I got my first email account. And I remember, the advent, it was specifically at John Brown when there was a cross-campus chatting. So they basically, they unveiled like a messaging service, but it wasn't open to all of America.
Right.
It was just on campus. There was like this software that you can open up, and we thought that was amazing.
Well, I remember 1999 was my freshman year. It was the last year you had to enroll in classes with paper enrollment sheets at Oklahoma State. In spring 2000, after Y2K didn't happen, we can talk about that. You could go online and enroll via, and I remember this because classes opened at midnight for like whatever section you were, and I stayed up till midnight so I could make sure to get to the best classes. Man, we're nerds. But one of the other things is they made this big deal about we're installing these new things called T1 lines, and what that meant is you could get on the internet without dialing up.
Oh yeah.
So up to that point, right? Again, the children will have no clue what we're talking about. But when you went on the internet, and by the way, it was pulling teeth slow.
Yeah.
But it was accompanied by it's all this noise, right, that you had to like dial up on the phone in order to get to it. The idea that there was a noiseless connection that was immediate and automatic, first year that happened, like that was a big deal because we were at a college big enough to do that. And in some ways, that absence of sound was the bell of a revolutionary change for our life. Yeah. And I think it's important to say, again, you'll hear people get in big arguments about generations. So there's Generation X, they're a certain way. And then there's the millennials, and they supposedly hate each other. Bud and I don't know about you, officially people act like millennials start the year I was born, 1981. I don't feel very millennial, and also I was in Oklahoma, so everything's like a decade behind. But what I do actually think makes a lot of sense is they talk about intergeneration, so the Zillennials, So that's the people who basically lived through television and telephone being the extent of most people running into technology when you were born. But by the time you hit college or adulthood, cell phones, internet, and that entire world. To grow up in the midst of that change is akin to growing up to when you were a kid, you went places in a horse and buggy, but by the time you were an adult, not an old lady, an adult, you could drive a car.
Yeah.
What's interesting, right, is generation after generation now has this happening repeatedly, but there's a real way in which that generation that sort of became teenagers and then adults, the end of the 90s and early 2000s, lived through massive revolutions, and the biggest revolution, Bud, is now we have revolutions every few years, if not months.
Yeah, and that's where this all harkens back to last week's discussion about like ecosystems, because these new technologies that we're talking about are new at the time. It's not like we have like a tool in our hand all of a sudden and we're living in the same world. It's really altered the entire landscape. So I was talking about the ethics of like kind of what do we pay attention to. I talk about this with Rachel, and sometimes like she'll have an entire busy day and be kind of like divorced from the news. And I'm like, oh, do you know this like major event happened? And we've talked about it. She's like, well, I don't know if I want to know that happened, you know, like if I'm mentally and emotionally prepared to it in light of all that's like else that's happening around me. But we sort of, so, I mean, I just think back to even like a couple centuries ago, like you might know if there's like a major tragedy in your town.
Right.
And then if something was massive enough, you know, like the Civil War breaks out, eventually you're living in Nebraska, you're like, oh,
right,
a civil war is happening. But today it's also immediate. And then the way we relate to it takes place like in this social media landscape. And so like how we communicate it about it in that space sort of changes even how we think about it and what we consider to be like resistance against injustice, etc.
Oh, I agree. And so this is a French thinker named Virilio. He gets at this point about speed and disaster, and we don't have to get into French theory necessarily, but there's speed in two ways. On one hand, what you were talking about is does this new speed obligate us different? So this is what I mean.
Yeah.
I remember, and I think you've said something like this. Maybe I got this from one of your talks you gave, but you know, when we read that Mary and Joseph didn't know where Jesus was, like that strikes us as weird. We go, what on earth?
Oh, yeah.
What are these parents doing? And you go, oh, well, the men and the women, you know, they walk to Jerusalem different. And when you're a certain age, you know, there's sort of like, are you a little kid still and you walk with your mom, or should you walk with your dad? And you can get into this sort of ideas. But of course, the bigger deal is there are no phones. And it's totally possible that you wouldn't know someone didn't go along with you until you reached your destination. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, fast forward to when we were kids in the 80s, and my mom, notorious worrywart, God bless Mom, but known particularly as an anxious mother even among my family, my friends group, she would let me go just ride my bike all day.
Yeah.
Why? Because what else was she going to do, right? Like she can't get a hold of me. And so, you know, there might be markers if the sun is high in the air, go stop by for lunch or whatever there might be. But even my mom, who's anxious, couldn't allow herself to, you know, worry about me until I wasn't getting home, like when the streetlights came on or something like this. But now you can check in with your kid and see where they're at. And so there's this question of, and, you know, this is sort of like how the debate goes, is people go, you shouldn't helicopter, you shouldn't hover. But on the other hand, if you have a kid that sort of like disappears, and people go like, well, why weren't you checking in on him? Like, what are you obligated to do? Conversely, you know, I point this out that, and I do believe this, that, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. Technology, the problems with technology are the same problems we had. They're just at a higher speed. However, like if you are clumsy, Bud, and you're walking, it is the case that you could be clumsy in such a way as to trip, fall, hit your head, and die. Yeah. But if you're clumsy and behind a vehicle, it's much more likely that the speed involved will make the ramifications of your clumsiness a lot more dangerous. And so it can be certainly the case that what might be, you know, danger that is inherent in any medium, like you can talk and get yourself into trouble. Mm-hmm. You can write something down and get yourself into trouble, but the sort of speed and force that the new technologies allow us to get into trouble obviously are faster and therefore more dangerous.
Well, I have kind of a question I want to probe in relation to what you were just sharing. And it was so for this episode, we almost discussed the new Vatican document about artificial intelligence,
but we wanted to give ourselves more time.
We're going to let it simmer. So I don't want to jump ahead, but in that document, there's this whole discussion of anthropology and how AI differs from the human person.
Right.
And this got me thinking. So we've tried to say with this series, like we've tried to tell folks, we're not Luddites. It's more about navigating the waters well than avoiding them altogether. But there is something with, our major forms of communication today are like through texting, social media, etc. And I wonder, so for me, that feels less embodied. Like if you and I are in the studio right now, we're together in person, and I can read your body language and see your facial gestures. Like there's ways you can communicate more powerfully by being in person. Are there? I guess I'll ask the question, then add one more qualification, like particular dangers to sort of how we communicate today. And part of what brought that to mind is I was talking to someone who's in radio, like in Catholic radio, and he was saying to me, when I first got this calling, I thought to myself, I'm going to do battle with Satan, because Scripture calls Satan the prince of the air. So it's like the prince of the air, there's this kind of like realm in which Satan like particularly inhabits. I thought that was interesting because I was like, oh man, you better be fit for the battle. I'm going to go engage this space where it says he's like the evil one is the prince of this space.
Well, to me, it's interesting because on one hand, and this is a shout out to our good friend Brian Sudlow, who has done a lot of work in French anti-technology from the 20th century. There were people who were against radio because they said it was blasphemous, and how they said it was blasphemous is because it imitated the ubiquity of God. So what does ubiquity mean? It means the ever-presence, the always capable of being communicable. So, right, like you can pray to God anywhere. Well, radio is this thing where, right, as long as you're within the sound waves reach, if you have the transistor, you can, so to speak, access God. Indeed, do you remember this? I think you were in this class with me. One time someone said that's Martin Luther's understanding of how the Eucharist works.
Yeah.
So clearly not, because the radio didn't exist, but I mean, like he's making an analogy. So to your point, I think you can go back and say all of those things, and that particularly with ours, I only point out that St. James says the tongue is the muscle that like basically steers most people into hell. So any medium has this problem, but it's also certainly the case that they each have unique, specific, and more or less dangerous temptations depending on the context. So the embodiment thing's interesting because on one hand, people act like books are incarnate, but you can't read body language in a book. But at least you're holding the book. Okay. There's also a way in which digital technology is the most embodied. And you go, what do I mean? And I say the physical resources necessary to make digital technology happen are the most strenuous on Earth's resources that have ever existed. You are not able to do a Zoom call except that literally people in the Congo crawled through caves to get what's the red stuff?
Is it cobalt? Or
yes,
something?
cobalt. Yes, thank you. And the sort of outlay, the physical outlay to make digital technology exist, just if you talk about the materials used, far more quote unquote embodied. Now, psychologically, is it embodied? And you go, no, right? There's a psychological way that there's not a human face, but then you go, well, but I can see on the screen, right? I can see grandma's face. And you can imagine former relationships where you would only know someone by a letter, so you never see their body language. But to your point, I think that there's a way in which it can make us think that there is more of a embodied connection than there is. And one of the benefits, right, of a letter is you go, I have the physical object, but that's it. I don't have the person before me. And anybody who's ever like thought they read body language on like a Zoom call and then found that they were wrong knows that this can be a problem as well. I don't think it's such that we're completely unique, as in like these have never been problems before. But again, the speed and the power certainly make them a different sort of animal. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, stick around. We'll be talking more about technology over the radio. A technology that did exist when we were a kid, by the way. Let's not make ourselves too old fogies. And basically every TV was in color. There were some. Okay. But anyway, this is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We are in our second episode talking about technology and how it ultimately has to do with Catholic social teaching and theology. Right now, I say we're reminiscing, bud. We're talking about the technological change that has happened in our lifetimes and trying to dwell a bit on the ramifications using our age group, as it were, and our life experiences as an example. I ended the last segment pointing out that let's not act like you and I are too old. There were radios. Did you even watch any? I mean, I saw a few black and white TVs. Mostly they were in color.
Oh, yeah, mostly color.
But to your point, there weren't pagers. I remember the first time I saw a cell phone. I didn't know that was possible. So that's what we're sort of talking about now, is how change within our lifetime demonstrates not only how important this subject is, but sort of the lines of how we need to talk about it.
Yeah, before we went to break, you were contrasting a bit like digital technologies with print technology and talking about, you said like there's something sort of like physically strenuous bringing some of the, like even something like a Zoom conversation into being. If you think about the infrastructure that had to be in place before we got there, I think in our circles, it's fair to say that folks are probably more suspicious of like hyper aware of the dangers of digital technology. We think about raising kids and like what smartphones and things give you access to, or like how they affect your attention span. But it's, as you were talking about like print technology and its own sort of limitations. So if I'm going to access knowledge in a book, I have to flip through all the pages and find the spot in the book that discusses the particular issue that I want to know about. And if you have like a large volume, sometimes you flip frantically. So I've had moments in my life where I had epiphanies through the media of digital technologies. And I was discussing when you and I went on a retreat recently where we were speakers for a group at St. Anthony's Parish. And I was sharing that like I had this kind of breakthrough in how I understood temple theology by a virtual reality chamber. Mm-hmm. So when I was at Duke, I was telling the folks at this retreat, like my summer job.
St. Augustine, by the way.
What did I say?
St. Anthony's.
Oh, we're just doing retreats everywhere. Ambrose, you're next. That's funny.
No, keep going. Temple virtual reality.
Yeah. So I had this summer job where like Duke had this massive virtual reality chamber. They bragged that it was the largest one, like largest enclosed chamber in North America.
Circa 2007?
Yep.
Wow.
And so, like the senior computer science students would do these senior projects. One student did actually a recreation of Purgatory. Another did the Dome of the Rock. But for my summer job, I gave people tours of Solomon's Temple. As I shared at this retreat, like I had always read about the temple in the Bible. I knew some of its significance, but to actually walk through it and see it sort of like to scale really impacted me. Like the altar on which sacrifice was made was massive. It was like 20 feet tall or something. The biblical scholars are checking my math there. But another piece was like the structure, the architectural renderings. They incorporated elements from the Garden of Eden. So like on the walls and the vestibule, entering the temple proper, there would be plants that had been mentioned in the Garden of Eden. So I kind of like my eyes were open, like, oh, the temple is recreating what Adam and Eve experienced in terms of this intimacy with God, this kind of like closeness to God's presence. And so, I had read the text for many years, but it was through that digital technology that, I got this new kind of grasp about what the temple was about. And I think that's where when we think about today's day and age, like we need skilled Catholics who are engaging and using those media. I know you've talked some about the archival powers of these technologies. I find all that really interesting.
Well, so again, like bringing this back to sort of biography, like you were talking about how this event, this thing that just seemed really, like a cool thing to do for a summer ended up being epiphanal. I can remember things like, I remember when Napster came out. This is already aging me. To you kids out there or people who are really old, Napster was sort of Apple Music, but back when it was illegal. Yeah. Right? It was the first file sharing service for music. And I remember staying up till 4 a.m, multiple nights, trying to get a hold of music that I had heard of but had no access to. So I was a pretty big music geek at the time. I'm a small music geek now, but was pretty big back then, man. And I remember hearing about like specific live recordings or like B-sides from Japan and you could go look for these things. And I remember getting to hear certain songs for the first time. You had to wait forever. Like one 4-minute song would take 2 hours. But I remember the archival power, right, of being able to share these files. I remember when Wikipedia first came to town, I was just defending Wikipedia today, not like completely, like it's not like a good enough article to cite in your paper, students. But if you're talking about a start to go find out stuff, it's pretty great, especially its links, to be honest. Mm-hmm. But you know what that reminded me of, Bud, is I was like an 8-year-old, and I was at my Aunt Marty's house, and I think she had 2 versions of Encyclopedia Britannica, and I remember hours. I remember, of course, reading the articles, but the coolest thing was it would refer you to other articles, right? So this is proto-hyperlink. And then because she had 2 Encyclopedia Britannicas, I'm almost dead sure she did. Maybe I'm conflating another moment in my life. But I remember where I would compare articles. I almost remember like family members being like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm trying to see how they changed. Well, that's something Wikipedia does now, that you can just go look at the talk and discussion page and see what's happening. That's a power that monks from the Middle Ages would simply be in awe of, what they were trying to do to preserve what they had in text. However, because of the ease that you do this, and this is, I think, what you meant when you were saying that it seems disincarnate. It's sort of frictionless now, right? Like when I had to like get the different books, and you were pointing this out, the experience, the actual physical feel of flipping through a book, finding it, and then going in a different book and comparing. That's not new information, but it's an experience that grounds how you learned that. And because that's all gone, it can seem frictionless. And so what I used to do, I remember, because I didn't have the encyclopedias, I would either write down notes. All this is proving is you and I are both big nerds. I'd either write down notes, or I would try my hardest to I'm going to remember this, right? But now what do we do with Wikipedia? Well, we might favorite the page, but actually what we usually do is like, oh, well, I'll just come back to Wikipedia if I need to remember it.
And that's where tradition is an argument sustained across time, and I feel like these newer technologies really enable that. You think about what's it called, the Glossa Ordinaria, the monastic commentary on Scripture, and that was just entered in the marginalia. We have that in spades.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, like, just on that one specifically, but if you and I were like students in the late 1980s, we'd have to go track that down at an obscure library. Like, you and I could take time right now and go find parts of the monastic gloss just to talk about on air at a finger snap.
But the challenge, I think, what we have a paucity of is wisdom, because part of what you're trying to do is, so I have these evenings where, especially if I can't sleep or something, I start kind of like, in scare quotes, researching a topic. So you're online and you want to know more.
The bunny trails.
Yeah, I've been reading about Malcolm X, and so it's like, well, what's the Nation of Islam about? And then you see a new hyperlink, like, who is Elijah Muhammad? And you start reading more and more, and all of a sudden, you're like way down the rabbit hole on the internet, and so it's harder to know like what to focus on in some ways, but the powers are really amazing. And I think when I was at the Newman Institute in Pittsburgh, I think some of the most interesting projects are being done in that space. So my friend Danny Michaels, he's doing some work with this.
I was going to talk about this.
Yeah. And like with some of the really like fast, powerful search engines and things that we have, and the way that we can make both images and text available to people very quickly. So like with some medieval manuscripts and things, they were very precious at that time. And that's why sometimes in libraries you see like even books like chained to tables and things like that. But like making like copying the scriptures, it wasn't this kind of haphazard thing. Oftentimes it was adorned with art. And sometimes thieves would like cut out the sacred art inside these scriptures. And so Danny, like one project he's doing is like restoring to these texts digitally. You sort of like reinsert. So they find the art in one library or space, and they transport it like back to where people can see it in its original form. In the same way, this really warms my heart for someone who doesn't love traveling long distances very much. Danny's done like a complete digital replica of the Basilica in Assisi. It's just really cool because the digital has this capacity to mimic space in such a way that you can explore the Basilica. It's not the same as being there, but what's different than being there, you get this in kind of bastardized form where like you go to like a museum. I say bastardized, like not as cool. But like, as you're walking through the museum, you have the headphones on and they're speaking, they're like narrating. But in this digital Basilica of Assisi, you can like click on a stained glass window and hear the history or hear an interpretation of the art. And I think it's an amazing way to encounter that space.
So I kind of brought this up in, this is a talk that we gave with a friend of the show, Brett Robinson. He and I gave a talk at Notre Dame, and it's called Temples of the Holy Ghost, if people want to go look at it in YouTube. Bo Bonner, Brett Robinson, Temples of the Holy Ghost. Digital Temples of the Holy Ghost, excuse me. And this is one of the things that prompted me to do that is, I mean, this big argument is that we should make digital temples on the internet so that it's not that just the meta of the world. But at any rate, what pertinent to this is it's not only, like you said, Bud, that we have this running commentary when we encounter it in the digital, but it's because of Danny and like this rendering that you can do things like make connections that sometimes are hard to see. For instance, in that Basilica, all of the artwork is in conversation with the art that's above it, below it, across from it, and diagonal from it. And in the digital, you can render that. You can say, like, these are the connections that are being made that either would take a long time for you to know, or even in person, you kind of have to crick your neck to sort of figure out. That's something that the digital affords. But there's things that the digital takes away. And this is where we'll probably talk about this more than once throughout this series. Marshall McLuhan, who you've heard me talk about again and again, but really the sort of pioneer Catholic thinker about media technology and media effects, he has this thing called the tetrad, and we don't need to get into all of it today. Maybe we should have an entire episode about the tetrad. Talk about getting kicked off air, Bud. We'll see about that. But what all he wants to say is when you think about media technologies, or I mean in technology in general, but the mediums particularly in their advancement, they go, anytime you have a new one, that medium enhances some aspect of our sensory experience. It reverses others. It obsolesces some. It gets rid of them, but then it retrieves others. And so some of that makes a lot of sense. The digital, like I said, it's this big archive. We can go access things in ways that was much harder, like even with text, but even like when you think of broadcast, right? There's only so much you can show on a screen, but it reverses some of like what we thought was important. So broadcasting is not nearly as important because who the gatekeepers are, I should say, and what they decide to broadcast is less important because now if it's on the internet, we can go find it if we want to. It obsolesces in some ways stars like it used to be. Like there's celebrities are a completely different thing now compared to what they were in TV age, but then it retrieves something. So there's a real medieval aspect about a lot of digital elements. I know I've brought that up about meme culture, for instance, where it's like jokes and marginalia in the Middle Ages. I think medieval monks would get meme culture, but also sort of a textuality that didn't exist in the television age. Okay, we don't need to get into it too much, but only just to say everything that comes about has its plus and minuses. And so, like you said, I can't even imagine, Bud, studying in like 1984, what it would be like to study now. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's just so much access we have. Like we think about John Henry Newman. Folks, you can go to newmanreader.org and read everything. Yeah. That didn't happen in 1984. There were things that were understudied in the 80s simply because they weren't as readily available to the everyman. You had to go track it down. Okay. However, what you did have, I can guarantee you dealt with like it was more precious. Mm-hmm. And so I even think about this again, just using pop music. When we got a hold of a CD, I think people our age, not all, but if you thought of yourself as a music person, I'm guessing that you can name B-sides and deep cuts off of like Pearl Jam albums that simply new listeners don't care about. Why is that the case? Because if your favorite person puts out an album now and you're like, oh, these 3 songs are awesome, but these 5 aren't, you'll just go find 5 different songs from someone else because you have the whole catalog. But I mean, if you got a CD, and let's go back. If you got a vinyl, you got a cassette. Cassette's even better. Let's do cassette. Because cassette, if you knew if the more you rewound and fast forwarded it, you were destroying the tape and you were just making the day that it broke come faster. So when you have a cassette, you listen to the whole thing. I know worthless, deep cut tracks from Coolio that I would not choose, except we just let that silly tape play the entire time while we were playing basketball outside in the summer in the 90s.
And that's where I see, I don't know, when you're kind of like talking to younger Catholics about this sort of thing, I see the digital as almost like space exploration. What I mean by that is you venture out and you engage it, and you can harness it well to accomplish amazing things. But you always have to come back to these embodied experiences, or like more embodied experiences. And what I think about that is like specifically with the sacraments, it's significant and important that, you can't confess your sins over the telephone.
And you also can't read an experience of the Eucharist.
Yeah.
So it's not just the digital, right?
Yeah.
Like reading about the Eucharist is not the Eucharist.
Well, I think that's a great point, because I wonder with, we all are trying to discern reasons why like many fell away from the practice of the faith over recent decades. And I wonder if it was an overemphasis on textuality. Oh. Because so many persons came into the faith through the church's sacred art, through its music. And, the art had this visceral character that communicated important things about the faith, which persons from like various levels of intelligence could internalize. We sort of fell for that Protestant ruse.
That's okay. So look, right? Like when you think about this, what are some of the polemic arguments, almost always typed and printed in a pamphlet because of the printing press, that were made against the Catholic Church? Oh, the Eucharist is just something that, like if, hocus pocus becomes magic, right? Oh, it's this thing that they act like you have to be present for so they can lord over their charms over you. But all you really have to do is read the Bible, the printed Bible, that used to, even if you were literate, were hard to come by. But now, think about like how tech savvy and privileged the argument that, all you need to do is read the Bible was at the time.
Yeah.
And notice that a lot of those anti-Catholic Protestant polemics were, these dumb Catholics are taking advantage of rubes who can't read.
Yeah.
And that would be like us saying like, oh, well, you're just like taking advantage of people who don't have an internet connection. That would be the same sort of deal. And so what I think is funny, Bud, is the reason I know that Catholicism was easier for me to get to when I went to seminary than I think other people is no matter how much we were Bible thumpers, and it really was a big deal that you read the Bible, and a lot of the arguments that like I have with family members where we don't mesh has to deal with, like you said, over-textuality. But that wasn't the most important part. Orality still was in backwoods Oklahoma. Like the preacher preaching, the orality of it was an event. And here's the big one, singing. Singing was very important to my brand of evangelical Protestantism. And I realized that when I started to enter into the Mass, it reminded me of that orality and that sort of, like you said, incarnational aspect that I remembered from childhood that was much more important than all of the intellectual textual arguments.
It's amazing that Christ is the most important person who ever walked this earth, and we don't have a single word written by him. In fact, the one passage that mentions him writing, he writes in the dirt, but the sacred author doesn't tell us what he wrote.
Right.
So when he wanted to communicate himself, like this, like the central moment of his life and his community that he built with his beloved disciples was the Eucharist. And but we don't, and you could say like, well, text was less important back then. Well, there were followers afterwards who wrote a lot of things down. And we certainly don't want to downplay this, like you and I, among anyone, like we're going to like praise the sacred text and what it communicates to us about God. But a really interesting conversation at a parish would be like, are we emphasizing this medium at the expense of others? And what does it mean to steward our resources in such a way that we encourage like these other forms of communicating the faith?
Well, and to close up here, I think to your point, this goes back to retrieval, right? That we need to retrieve things that used to be natural. So when you had fewer texts, what came natural is you're like, well, I only had 5 texts and I read them. I guess I'm going to meditate on them now, right? Because you kind of had to. What else were you going to do? We can fill our days, Bud, reading a new thing, reading a new thing, reading a new thing. And so we just have to be far more intentional about meditating on things than people used to, because in the back of the day, when all you really could do, like you go back far enough, even if you were learned and literate, you would have to hear the text read and you go, okay, well, that was my only chance. I'm really going to pay attention, and now I'm going to meditate on it, and that's how I'm going to extend its influence on me. Well, now I can read anything. So then we have to have communities meaningfully saying, it's time not to read a new thing. Let's read it again and meditate on it. Which, what is that, bud? A lectionary. So notice that we don't keep reading new stuff, liturgy. We do read the same stuff again. We read it in short amounts. We meditate on it. We just have to be intentional about it. And I think intentionality is going to be something that threads through all of these conversations. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, we went through a really quick tour, I would say, of our lives and the transformational media and technology aspects of it. We mostly stuck with media. Dude, we could go on what cars are like. There are airbags now. You should wear seatbelts. I mean, you can get into things. By the way, like broccoli, Brussels sprouts taste good. What food's available. I know we stuck with media because it's like important to what we were talking about. But if you could talk to 3-year-old Bud Marr and tell him what it was like in 2025, a lot of it would be, oh, hey, the stuff that was happening then, we've just expanded on it. But a lot of it would be totally like, what are you talking about?
No, it's true. And I'm glad you jumped in for the last minute there, because I was about to get into like Christ incarnate is the one instance where the medium is the message, and that truly is an episode unto itself. So
yeah, there's a lot of episodes into themselves.
You landed the helicopter well.
Well, speaking of landing helicopters and techniques and things that are important in reflection, but if people want to join the prayer life of Iowa Catholic Radio, what are ways they can do so?
Yeah, please do join us in our prayer life. We pray the rosary on air at 4:30 a.m., 6 a.m., 10 a.m., and 8:30 at night. Divine Mercy Chaplet, right when you would expect, right before 3 p.m., but you can also hop on the Iowa Catholic Radio app and pray the rosary with us anytime, anywhere.
And if you want to be involved in the events in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, even though that area is expanding and we're trying to make sure that we can note, you go to iowacatholicradio.com to the events page and you see a lot of things coming up. One of the big ones, of course, is our spring fundraiser, which will be happening later in February. The big one is, there's two big ones. On March 1st, there's all sorts of things happening. So, for instance, Scott Hahn will be at St. Francis of Assisi Parish in West Des Moines, but then also the Forge Conference, which I know multiple people, if you're listening to the Catholic Morning Show, for instance, we've interviewed them. So that's a big one. But then, of course, it's April 2nd. Our 20th anniversary celebration of Iowa Catholic Radio with Father Mike, what's his
Schmitz?
Yes, thank you. I knew it was something. Yeah. But at any rate, that's us fundraiser, but also celebrating 20 years of Iowa Catholic Radio. But like I said, the spring fundraiser is coming up, and I can only throw out there that remember that this is a ministry that's not just the folks that you hear on air or behind the boards or behind the desk. It's your ministry as well. You make it possible by your volunteering and your prayers, but most certainly also by your material support through donations. You can go to the iowacatholicradio.com and hit the donate button, Iowa Catholic Radio app, or call or text 515-223-1150 to make sure to say thank you for what God has allowed to happen in our listening area and to keep that ministry going on. But that was a nice trip down memory lane that I don't think fell into nostalgia. It was just very helpful, hopefully, to ground people in some biography about why these technological changes are so big. And we didn't even mention like football or sports or things we liked better back then.
I hope I didn't derail your nostalgia by jumping in there with some commentary, but I saw some openings, jumped on them. You could do an episode on sports. I remember when Nebraska used to be good at football and being in college and like each week seeing the BCS standings, but instead of having those like ready and available, I'd have to go to the computer lab, log in, like see what's happening that week.
Uphill in the snow both ways. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, station, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast.